you so much for joining us for this latest episode of RF Breakthrough. Today, we're talking with some amazing panelists about energy equity issues. More specifically, we'll dig into the importance of climate data collection, its influence on policy, and how this all ties into supporting those who are doing some amazing work on the ground. For those of you I'm meeting for the first time, my name is Carly Lanning. I'm the Storytelling and Content Strategy Manager for the Innovation team here at the Rockefeller Foundation. What spurred the topic of today's breakthrough was a recently released report from one of our longtime grantees, DataKind, who you will be hearing from shortly. In their energy equity report, DataKind shows that energy equity issues in the US are predominantly driven by household incomes, with few options for most households to use less expensive and more sustainable energy sources. The report also lays out data science options to improve research that could then go on to inform policy and community work. Today, we'll hear more about the data collection element of this work, advice for your own involvement, and so much more. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the stars of this breakthrough, our panelists. Joining us today, we have Caitlin Augustine, Vice President of Product and Programming at DataKind, an amazing organization harnessing the power of data science and artificial intelligence in service of humanity. We also are joined by Subin Devar, co-founder and executive director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, an inspiring organization providing energy policy solutions focused on equity to marginalized communities within the US. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Jason Engel, co-founder and co-director of the Ecological Citizens Project, a nonprofit doing incredible work in upstate New York, supporting community-owned solar and food initiatives. Thank you all so much for being here. I just made reference to the energy equity report, but would love for us to dive a little deeper. So Caitlin, if I could throw it to you first, would you start by sharing some of the key takeaways that DataKind found in this report?
Absolutely. Carly, thank you and the Rockefeller team so much for having me today and for hosting this conversation on energy equity. To take a quick step back on the report, DataKind and the Rockefeller Foundation actually started this conversation over a year ago about approaching climate and environment problems with an analytics for equity lens. And within that focus, we started to look for spaces where the impacts and the opportunities of policies were playing out on a local community level in the United States. DataKind had done some individual project work in the energy space broadly. We worked with Clean Coalition to identify rooftops well suited for solar panels. We worked with Community Lattice on brownfields cleanup prediction in the aftermath of oil and gas extraction. But we knew we wanted to understand the sector as a whole and the places that data science, machine learning, and AI could come into being. So armed with that background and an interest in this data for social impact, we brought together a team of expert researchers with deep experience in federal energy policy, local community benefits access, and the environmental justice movement as we built this report and ultimately the greater body of work. And the three takeaways that are governing and really pushing us as we look forward into using data in energy equity are, first, that energy access does not mean energy equity. And we need to address energy poverty and energy choice as key dimensions of energy equity. Second, that the problem of energy inequity, this unequal access and this unequal choice, spans the United States. It's not simply a rural problem, a northern problem, or a coastal problem. And so when we start to look at policy solutions, we need to look at solutions that can benefit the whole of America. And then third, and the most optimistic one, that there are rich data sets available that can help drive policies and investments to close this gap on energy equity. But the data is siloed and often inaccessible to a decision maker. So there is a significant opportunity for data-ready actors like DataKind and others on this call, both talking and listening today, to take that information and turn it into tools to drive impact.
That was a beautiful answer, Caitlin, I gotta say. I loved all of the intersecting thoughtfulness that goes into it and all the different elements that you really, and DataKind really connects into collecting their research. I would love to hear a little bit more, why is data science and the collection of data such a vital tool in the fight for energy equity?
Yeah, so I would say collection of data is key, right? We can't change what we don't know. And we need to know who is represented in the data, what experiences are represented, and what the limitations of the data is, so that we can improve our collection techniques, improve the processes of which we're gathering it, the timeliness, et cetera. But with that data in hand, we know that data science can be part of the solution. At DataKind, we think that data science can fundamentally help us do three things. It can help us observe the current state of our world. It can help us reason through what we hope will happen next in the world. And it can help us drive action. So when we think about energy equity and the way that we can use data science, machine learning, and AI, we can think about it in those three lenses. We can use data to observe the state of the world using geospatial analysis, data interpolation, statistics. All of those things can help us make sense of the current state of energy equity in the United States. And it can help us create and communicate that shared understanding of the world. And with that shared understanding, we can then move toward reasoning. What happens if we introduce a new policy, a new change? What happens if another pandemic hits or a major snowstorm comes into a particular area? This type of probabilistic modeling using machine learning and AI, they can help us anticipate what might happen in the future so that we can reason through these different courses of action. And then finally, we can use data to take action. Things like machine learning, AI, automation. These tools, they can help us process and make decisions far faster than a human might. I mentioned DataKind's work with Clean Coalition. We used hundreds of satellite images and to identify where the best rooftops might be for putting in solar panels. For a human, that could have taken hours, days, months, years. Training a machine learning model, you can do it in minutes, seconds even. Doing that type of processing and bringing in data science tools to do so means that we can do more with the resources we have on hand. And I think that is so key as we try to tackle these major systemic problems in the equity space.
Amazing. Subin, I'm very curious. Caitlin was talking about data's influence on policy, and really curious to ask you, how is data playing a role within the work that you do? And also, from your perspective, what do you think people working on tangible projects experience when considering energy indicators and equity?
Well, let me break those two apart. I'd say first, in terms of the role of data science and data collection and energy equity, I see a balance between opportunities and limits. On the one hand, there's the opportunity to advance energy equity, as Caitlin put, by really mapping the current state of things, which is really mapping inequities. Along the way, mapping our progress to address those inequities. And really crucially, at each of these intervening stages, knowing how to iterate to improve our progress, knowing where we're succeeding and where we're falling short, and actually, are these inequities getting better? Are they changing? Of course, and trying to find as much correlation to the mechanisms that we have control over. And it goes beyond data around just access to energy, access to electricity, or even the affordability. I think the opportunity of data is to go beyond and look at all of the benefits of the energy system, like who's participating in policymaking. There's a whole array of data and reporting that we haven't dug into to see who's actually shaping our energy rules and our policy, who's intervening, what type of entities, what type of demographics, or second, what is the breakdown in the economic benefits of the energy system? Let's analyze and find better data about the businesses that are going to expand rapidly in this era of increasing federal and state policy. Who are the owners and investors increasing wealth? And let's look at the demographics around that. And where are the jobs going? Or third, there's an opportunity for data to get us way further in understanding the health inequities or improvements. Are there changes in asthma rates in particular locations? And can we look at that based on demographics and where there have been particularly racial inequities in health disparities tied to our current energy system? So there are a lot of opportunities, but I'd say those opportunities are not guaranteed, nor, to be frank, is it the path that we're on. I don't think that data is inherently good or bad. It's driven by someone or something. And at the moment, we don't really have a roadmap designed by the most impacted communities, low wealth, low income, or people of color, vulnerable populations, at the center of really designing frameworks and mechanisms that pinpoint the goals and purposes of data. And so that's the stage in which we need to further develop. And of course, these things can happen simultaneously. Ultimately, I think the need is for clear goals and accountability mechanisms. We drafted the Initiative for Energy Justice drafted, I guess, about a couple of years ago, a report called the Justice in 100 Metrics, where we talk about the accountability mechanisms that are really necessary and an iterative cycle of grounding in the participation of marginalized communities, to set clear definitions, and then to have adequate reporting, and then have an iterative cycle of accountability based on that reporting to then begin the process again of policymaking. You had asked a second question, which around what do people working on these projects think about energy indicators and equity. And I think my first thought to that is which people. The folks that we talk to, there's such a range of experiences, I'd say. And so I think about policymakers, utilities, and advocates, and probably hear a lot of different questions. What is it? I think policymakers and utilities are often asking about what are equity indicators? What's my lane, particularly utilities? Why do we have anything to do with equity? Why does this feel so inadequate? I think to many of the advocates, even when there are efforts to do something about energy equity. Or on the other side, why does this feel so extra? Which is what I've heard from folks who feel like we're doing more than we should. This is not our business. Or ultimately, how do we balance listening and the feeling of falling short, which is a sentiment I think policymakers can often feel when they're both trying to be responsive to community input and public participation, but feeling like they're not able to meet all of those needs. And I think ultimately the answer to that is the need for an iterative cycle to constantly set definitions and reporting and have data that won't ultimately achieve everything that community solutions and community goals are asking for, but then can at least go to that iterative cycle of where are we falling short and what do we do in the next round.
That reflective element is so important, and also how it really stands out to me how rooted your work is in really listening to communities. And that's a hard place to be, and hearing what communities need and not in some ways being able to meet it or get the right people in the room at that moment. And you're kind of between so many different parties too. And it reminds me, Jason, a lot of your work, which is so both on long haul farms as well as the Ecological Citizens Project, so rooted in empowering the community. And I would love to hear from you, what do you see as really being the biggest energy equity issues facing communities right now?
Thank you so much, Carly. So at the Ecological Citizens Project, we really work on innovative local solutions to global problems at the community level. And so I think I want to kind of, tackle this question about, what we're seeing with energy equity within the context of a community-owned solar project that we're working on in the city of Peekskill. And of course, if we're grounding ourselves in this conversation about energy equity, we're talking about working in environmentally disadvantaged communities to make sure that low-income residents are more energy secure and they actually realize the benefits of the renewable energy opportunity. So the city of Peekskill, we're working with Working Power jointly, who is a Rockefeller grantee, in the city of Peekskill to develop 1 megawatt of community-owned solar. And just to kind of put Peekskill in context, it's about 50 miles north of New York City, a post-industrial city of about 30,000. It's a majority community, primarily Latino, African American. It is low income. It is 80% of the students in the school district are on free and reduced lunch. A third of households pay more than 50% of their income in housing costs. So, but on top of that, which is not a surprise, I'm sure, to Subin or Caitlin or to you, they're a environmental justice community designated by New York State. So they are facing, they have Wheelabrator Westchester in their community, a garbage incinerator, the largest polluter in Westchester County. They have the expansion of the Algonquin natural gas pipeline going through their city. And they now have they had Indian Point, but they have the decommissioning of Indian Point, which is now in that process talking about releasing 1 million gallons of radioactive water into the Hudson. So this is a community that has faced environmental disadvantages. And so how do we work with them to make sure that there's energy equity there? And so our project with Working Power is to develop 1 megawatt of community-owned solar. Just to kind of talk about what that means, Subin, you raised the point, like a lot of your work is looking at, who is going to benefit from this transfer to the renewable energy system, which businesses are going to benefit and how. And so, kind of working that at the local level, Working Power, deciding who owns the renewable systems we build is about deciding who benefits and, more importantly, who makes the decisions about where profits from renewable energy go and who benefits from them. And so in this City of Peekskill project, that 1 megawatt would, and this is analysis by Working Power, would produce enough renewable energy for 340 households. And it would create about $2.8 million over 25 years in unallocated benefits. I use that term unallocated benefits, which means those would have been profits in a conventionally owned system. But in a community-owned system, it is the community owners. The Ecological Citizens Project would be half owner, along with Working Power and their joint ownership model. We're talking to the NAACP of Peekskill. That decision-making power is, where do the benefits go? Do they go to as larger returns to private investors, or do they go to distributing greater benefits from the system? And so in this case, under our benefit flow, we would see about, out of that $2.8 million over 25 years, we would see about 22% of that go to lease payments to property owners as we lease their rooftops, or in the city's case, their municipal garages and parking lots. We would see about 32% go to the creation of a community benefit fund, which would fund the food sovereignty work we do and community-directed projects. And we would see mostly half of it go to 20% electricity bill savings for those 340 low and moderate income households. And I guess I'll just say that, that is the benefit of ownership. Those are value-based decisions to decide where that revenue goes. The conventional solar model in community solar is to offer subscribers a 10% discount on their electricity bill. That's kind of the going rate in the conventional market. We've decided with Working Power to double that to 20% electricity bill savings. We've decided to target those 340 subscribers to low and moderate income households. Those are value-based decisions. And, my final point, coming to Caitlin's work and the work that DataKind does, is that it's not easy to subscribe low-income households to get those electricity bill savings, for a number of reasons. Greenwashing, because low-income households have a lot of other things they're worried about. And so the type of data that Caitlin's talking about is incredibly useful to target those sorts of households that would get those benefits. Because really it's about more than just like emailing a household. It's about the community grassroots organizing work of going door to door, trusted people, trying to make that benefit known. And so in our project in Peekskill, in lieu of having the type of data that DataKind's working on, we would love to have it, Caitlin, by the way, if you could do that for the city of Peekskill, is that we have to work in lieu of that with data like, we're working with the Peekskill Housing Authority. We're working with, one of their public housing projects, Dunbar Heights. There's 100 households. We know that they pay their individual electricity bills. Con Ed Westchester has some of the highest electricity bills in the country. So we know that those folks are the most energy burdened. And so that is going door to door. We're working with the food pantry in Peekskill because they serve those most in need. And I think, I'll end by saying that, there's a lot of innovation that needs to go on. Right now, we're working to secure funding to put into this model, which says, a lot of solar developers just subscribe anybody. They don't really care if it's a low income household that subscribes. But I think we need to flip that, and we should be paying our community-based organization partners to subscribe the households and the members they work with. That's right now a soft cost in the solar development field. And we need to bring that into models like this and pay community-based organizations to go out and do the hard work of subscribing and making sure we get to that energy equity finish line. So I'll leave it at that for the moment. But I'm really happy to be on a part of this breakthrough conversation with you and with folks like Subin and Caitlin that are doing this essential work and kind of trying to marry it all together, the grassroots and the high level work.
Amazing. And I'd love to learn a little bit more because, what have been the challenges in engaging the community around this? A lot of individuals, just for many life reasons, potentially don't have the energy to dive into this work or the bandwidth to really take in a lot of information about it. What have been the challenges and potential solutions you found? And what advice would you have for others who are looking to start engaging within their community around these issues?
I would say, one challenge when you're talking about community ownership is just, and you're going to groups like the Peekskill NAACP, is just getting people's minds around the idea that they can own these energy assets. I think that is a challenge because we live in a highly wealth unequal society. We live in a society where most of the benefits are flowing to a small number of people. So one is just kind of, giving people a model that allows them to kind of think about what it means to own an asset like that. In this case, multi-million-dollar solar asset. A second challenge kind of related is that we live in a society where people are always being sold things. And so there's a greenwashing aspect of, people get, energy service providers, join this community. So people are being bombarded with kind of things all the time. And I think there's a natural tendency to not believe it. And especially if it sounds like something that's too good to be true, like 20% discount on your electricity bill. And so I think that challenge, and this gets to your point about advice to others, is, we have to use the sort of policy work that Subin's doing and is so valuable. We have to use the data that Caitlin is producing. It's so valuable. But we have to marry it to local grassroots groups that have community relationships and have the trust of the sorts of households we're trying to reach. So, like I said, groups like the NAACP and Peekskill, groups like the Peekskill Area Pastors Association. It is the group of all of the interdenominational ministers in Peekskill. We have to work with the people that already have the trust of the people we're trying to serve and find ways to have them be the message bearers, as opposed to kind of flyers and cold calls and robotic calls that no one kind of really hears anymore.
Jason, I feel like you perfectly set me up to chat with Subin for my next question, which, Subin, from your, now taking it to the policy level, from your perspective, what advice do you have in maintaining and having that connection with grassroots organizations, from policymakers and from advocates?
Yeah, I think so. One aspect is at the core, thinking about accountability, no matter what the type of organization is, nor the level of the jurisdiction that they operate at, there's always some avenue in which an organization can be accountable to impacted communities and community voices. Um, and so I think when you zoom out to the level of state or federal policy, that can look like um, either the public sector or private sector um, being responsive through their what is the on the nonprofit sector, how is that organization operating themselves, how much do they integrate into their strategic planning process, not just fourth tier down the ladder once in a while on a project. Oh, because we have to check off some engagement process, let's go and see, like, who do you know that's a person of color, or do you know anyone that we can loop into this project? That is not responsiveness to the grassroots. It's at the level of the decision making for 3 to 5 years out of what the nonprofit organization is going to do, whether it's a small or large national environmental group. And on the business side, I think there's such a spectrum of um, from community-owned nonprofit type solar developers to private but still responsive and accountable to community, in between, as Jason was starting to illuminate the example of like local examples. There are various forms of collective and cooperative ownership and governance structures, all the way to just standard large for-profit businesses that still can have a total array of different ways in which they approach and respond to communities. So I think that could be through membership in their board or their advisory. But I think the bottom line is that it has to be really baked into the larger design and strategy and governance of the organizations themselves, to really be responsive to community voices and grassroots.
And if I could ask you some further advice, how do we take advantage of the suite of federal laws and environmental justice announcements and advance further policy work and energy access for low-income households?
Yeah, I think this is a natural sort of next step to that question, which is take that level of accountability, and whether with the sort of advancements that we've seen in federal policy and their shortcomings, there's a necessity on, say, the public sector side with nonprofits to support and fund accountable groups that are bringing in professionals who come from an environmental justice background, who come from low wealth backgrounds, have either direct ties to or close accountability to vulnerable populations and communities of color. Groups like Just Solutions Collective, Emerald Cities Collaborative, a growing coalition called the Energy Democracy Project, Taproot Earth, formerly the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, or the Climate Justice Alliance. There are a lot of groups that are equity and justice centered first, plus working on energy and climate issues. And so it's baked into the heart of their DNA. And then on the other side, there are groups like Working Power. There's another group called People's Solar Energy Fund that are on the project development side. So we need to think about the market participants. Most of all of the federal policies are targeting market actors. It's less this sort of top-down regulatory framework of states and utilities, you must do X, Y, Z. It's their incentives. And so there's a big question of to take advantage of advancing equity through that federal framework. It is very much going to be a process of supporting, advancing both the nonprofit and market sector types of groups that are really actually accountable to the grassroots, to marginalized communities. And second of all, in terms of advancing further from where we are right now, I'd say one key thing is to ensure that we have from that participation of communities, you inevitably have a more expansive and flexible definition of energy equity. It goes beyond just energy access in the sense of like, can you turn the lights on? Again, it's access to the energy system benefits. And who are you actually talking about? It goes beyond just low income, and you look at it through an anti-oppressive lens, an intersectional lens of different types of identity groups and their marginalization, and who has borne many of the inequities of the energy system up till now. But let's turn that into something really concrete. What do you do in research and development on the policy side? I think you break it down by jurisdiction and issues. But for example, on the supply side in the energy sector, the federal framework is not one that has prescribed what sources of, it has not defined clean energy or renewable energy to really narrow it down. And so there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that we advance renewable energy sources that have less harms to communities, solar and wind, as opposed to carbon capture and sequestration, which would inevitably just double down on fossil fuel power plants and the criteria of pollution for communities nearby, air pollution and water pollution. And so what do we do to advance further? We have to work on both the policy and market side to advance the cleanest and most equitable forms of our energy system moving forward. And lastly, but most importantly, we have to invest in people. The capacity building of communities and organizations at the local level, at the state level, that's where a lot of the work is moving now. The implementation at the local and state level. So can the organizations that Jason has been talking about and those communities that are working at the local level, can they really participate in policymaking? What do we need to do to make sure that they have access to be heard, to have the data, the resources, the evidence to go toe-to-toe with utilities as utilities are trying to push back as much as they can, both on the quick pathway to decarbonization, which utilities are trying to slow roll, as well as the path to equity, which utilities will try to slow down. And lastly, people in the sense of expanding the field of energy equity professionals. That is number one of the hugest gaps. There is not currently a pathway for young professionals to enter much of a field for energy equity or energy justice. And so that has to be greatly expanded for us to be able to have the advances in policy research and project implementation to really see not just energy access, but the access to the benefits of the energy system really be advanced at all levels within the U.S.
That was so thoughtfully put. Thank you. And Caitlin, I would love to get your researcher's perspective a bit, because I think one thing that we've all been a little curious about, especially with DataKind, how do you really go about in data collection and the sharing of data? How do you make that an equitable practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks so much for asking it, Carly. And to my fellow panelists, what an amazing conversation, really about the end use of data. Because as Subin said, data isn't good or bad inherently. It is just one more tool that we have at our disposal. So at DataKind, we strive to incorporate an equity approach into all of our work. So when we think about how to make data, such as the data we're talking about on energy equity, accessible and actionable, we approach it in a few ways. So the first is to think about the problem that we are trying to solve, right? So that's working with social impact organizations who are trying to do good in the world, trying to make these changes in encouraging equitable access to energy choice, reducing the burden of cost energy. What problems are they trying to solve that could be enhanced by having a data-driven tool? This is counter to perhaps many approaches that frankly I've been guilty of too, of the idea of a field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. Like, oh man, there's so much data. Let me just make this awesome dashboard. Let me create these great insights. People will surely look at it. That is 100% never the case. So the first step to making data access and data use equitable is understanding the problems that are deeply felt within the sector and working closely with the social actors who are at the heart of these community conversations, who are the field team working to drive change. Once that is understood, it's actually taking the time with the data. Some of it might be pure new data collection, but frankly, there's so much information already available out there. Someone, and this is often where DataKind comes in, needs to spend the effort on cleaning, harmonizing, and making interoperable those hundreds or even thousands of data sets. An example of an organization who DataKind's worked with who's made this type of approach work really well for policymakers is the Black Wealth Data Center. Black Wealth Data Center started with a premise of there is inequity in racial wealth in the United States, and that we need to close that disparity, that we need to ensure equal access to wealth building opportunities across all demographics. But the availability of race disaggregated data was incredibly hard to find. And so they and DataKind, we worked together to bring together over 36 different data sets to then start to build visualizations to drive understanding of the linkages between homeownership and wealth accrual and education and wealth accrual. I mentioned this example to say it's these types of tools and these types of close collaborations where the problem has been identified deeply through a sector engagement, and the tools are made accessible to any level of data maturity. You simply have to go to the Black Wealth Data Center website to view a visualization and to export the data that you might need for your particular problem. When we build these types of solutions, so after we've invested time in cleaning, developing, and harmonizing to build a solution, at DataKind, we adhere to a standard of practice called the Digital Public Good Standard. And this is a standard of solution development that does no harm by design. And this is a really key point to make because when we are talking about energy equity and so many of these other systemic inequity problems across the United States, we are talking about data representing incredibly vulnerable and historically marginalized populations. So we need to build tools that do no harm by design. It's not just that we need to be concerned about what happens when a project fails, but what happens when a project succeeds, and how do you put safeguards in place against that? An organization who I think has done this really well is Community Lattice, who DataKind worked with on an analysis of Brownfield's cost program, and they've democratized access to the estimated costs of revitalizing a particular community space, something that typically was gatekept by consultants who might charge hundreds of dollars for that initial assessment. You can do through their website. And they've built that tool in a way that has taken deep community engagement and engendered a lot of trust within it. And then finally, the final step I'll just mention on this approach to making the collection and use of data equitable is thinking about why you need to collect data and if there are alternatives. We need to remove the burden of reporting from the individual. We need to remove that piece of knowledge or the accountability to getting access to something like an energy benefits program from the federal government from the individual who must opt in. So a person who would have to have the knowledge that the program exists and spend the time on an online application and then do all the follow-up. What can we do to flip that script to make it an opt-out? How can we use data to say, you are eligible, and we are going to opt you into having this benefit unless you elect to opt out of it? And where are there places where instead of asking someone to share their information yet one more time, we could use synthetic data or proxy data or other pieces of information that help us drive policy forward, but don't put the intellectual burden on some of the most vulnerable community members.
Amazing. And I would love to wrap us up with a bit of a question for all three of you. So maybe we can go in Caitlin, Subin, Jason order. But, you know, in hearing these conversations, what advice do you have for those who are joining the fight, this long-term fight for energy equity, and having this mindset of how do you really intersect these three different fields to create work around energy equity? Caitlin,
Carly, I think you said I was kicking off. So I'll just say, you know, my biggest piece of advice is to seek out collaborations and seek out the opportunities to bring these new tools and approaches together, you know, bringing data science into the advocacy and policy work. Conversations like this are amazing because Jason and I will follow up after this so that I can give him insights from his particular geography of interest so he can use that. That wouldn't have happened if not for this call today. So being open to working across domains and across interest areas, I think, is the best way to start to drive the impact we hope to achieve.
I think I'd offer the advice to everyone on my team knows that probably the word I use the most is just iteration. But the process of inquiry and iteration, I think, is so key to energy equity. It's key to any field, but particularly a field in which it's new and it's learning, and it's at the intersection with our values. And we can feel confused, we can feel frustrated in the conversations that doing this work requires. And so the inquiry and iteration is not just like on paper in our work, and which is important. It's in ourselves, like, wow, what did I just feel when I just had that conversation? What came up for me? And okay, how do I iterate with that? And what did someone else like get when we spoke? And what does our next conversation look like? And so I think that process of inquiry and iteration is important in our work, in policymaking, in our conversations, but also internally in trying to grow a muscle to think about equity in our work operationally as well as programmatically, and ultimately that it's work that will. I think my advice is to follow that inquiry and iteration from a place of curiosity and hope. I think because it can only lead to growth for yourself, for your team, for the work that you put out there. Ultimately, I'm also just really excited and hopeful in this moment in which energy equity has become such a important piece of a larger conversation. And so, you know, I want folks to be successful in advancing it.
I guess I would, if I was giving advice to folks jumping into this work, especially at the community level, I would say that you've got to look past the darkness to the hope. I mean, in the sense that, you know, we are living in a time of, you know, systems breakdown, or at least the idea that systems aren't delivering the benefits to the most people as they should be, whether we're talking about energy or food or the economy. And so I think that the hopeful part of living in that time period is that we are injecting new values into systems, and we're rebuilding the way things should be done. as they're breaking down. And I think everybody on the call is a part of that, using data in new ways, bringing people into the policy decision in new ways, changing who owns solar asset in new ways. So I think it's very, very important to maintain that sense of hope amidst, kind of what can sometimes, be a challenging environment, because there are a lot of people coming together to build new ways of doing things. And, I would say when we're talking about energy equity, just I was thinking, like, how does our organization on Long Haul Farm, which, kind of has a core root in food sovereignty issues and food, how do we get pulled into energy equity? And I think it's because, like, energy equity is bigger than just energy. It's broader. It has more potential. And so from our perspective, in trying to make that tent bigger, we live in a world where, food is a commodity, right? Where the best and most healthy food goes to the people who have the greatest ability to pay for it. People who don't have the ability to pay for it either get less healthy food or are food insecure. And so for many years, as we were butting our heads up against that question, well, how do you make food a human right? How do you make sure that people who need food get it? You kind of have to drag it out of the commodity world. And in a weird way, Carly, this is how we kind of backed into energy equity, because if you can find a way to build solar and take a revenue stream from it and put it to food sovereignty work, you're suddenly flipping kind of farming. The farmer is getting paid a living wage from solar to grow food for those in their community who need it. And I think that, if we do this and we think creatively in this time of flux, we can use data, we can influence policy, and we can rebuild, we can, like, kind of seize this generational chance in building the new energy economy to put the benefits towards equity, not only across energy, but across things like food justice. And I would just kind of leave it by saying, like, from our perspective, we feel very lucky to have found a partner like Working Power, who is, they are the solar development and financing side of our project. But they just happen to be like a solar developer with a heart. Their values aligned with this idea of shared ownership and community benefit. And so I guess I would leave it that, these conversations, like Caitlin said, help us kind of seed work with each other across these different levels that we're working at. But I think they do what you asked, Carly, which is to kind of give people jumping into this fight and this movement, different points they can enter in it, and the belief that they can start locally and build it within their community. And it's a chance that, in some ways we're all lucky to live in, because we're building things in a new way.
Beautiful. I know I speak for everyone here. I feel super hopeful having listened to this conversation and just hearing more about all the really interesting and, personalized and really thoughtful work that each of you is doing. So, that is a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much to each of you for spending your time with me, sharing your advice and your wisdom. It's been great to hear from you, and so excited for what is to come. And, for those of you tuning in online, thank you so much for being here today. We'd love to hear more about your thoughts on this conversation if you want to share them through the hashtag RFBreakthrough. And until next time, we'll see you soon.